That's sleeping but not dead.
That was back during the pandemic, yeah, you couldn't get one yet for that kind of stuff, so.
All right.
It's funny, that story.
No, yeah, it's coming down.
We're going to go over.
Oh, she's like inside, like there. She thought it might be dead, she has a dog. Fine.
We are live.
Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Tuesday. Happy Tuesday. Hope everyone is well. A couple of public service announcements before we get into our learning today. This will be the final this will be the final of the 3-session conversation on our social justice core positions. There will be lunch and learn next Tuesday. And I'm going to read to you the description. Lunch and learn, the Song of Redemption and the Song of Confession with Cantor Josh Breitzer, who is coming down to spend Shabbat Shira with us. He's going to be teaching lunch and learn next Tuesday. Same structure right here in the Beit Midrash in person and on Zoom, but just a different content and different instructor than what we've had the last couple of weeks in January. So if you are a regular to lunch and learn, you can do as you regularly do. And if you are wanting to learn more about the Song of Redemption and Confession, extra special reason to bring your friends so they can learn along with you. Okay? If I can ask everyone just to check their phones to make sure they're set on silent so we can jump right into it. We have spent the last couple of weeks building out what I will call the foundation of our social justice work, right? Which was the identification of the congregation that we wanted to expand our work from direct service into what we call civic engagement, right? That's the advocacy, the lobbying, the working in collaboration and in networks to really try to move, in some ways it's like that old saying, give me a lever long enough that I can move the world. You got to build that lever, right? And you build that lever by building relationships, right? If one synagogue says it wants something, maybe the local officials will listen. But if all of the Reform congregations in Florida get together with dozens of other houses of worship around the states, now we're building a longer lever that we can pull down on to try to effectuate whatever change we might want to make. What will that change be? Well, that change has to come, and we said from the beginning, it has to emanate from our tradition. And so we talked about the 5 value propositions, 5 statements of Jewish life that are already inscribed on the walls of our congregation about not standing idly by, about loving the stranger, about pursuing justice, about Israel taking care of one another, and about building for the next generation. That those 5 values are the sort of the pylons that go in the ground underneath the foundation that really set our work on the bedrock. And then the texts of our tradition are going to be the edifice that builds up. And last week, we looked at one of our core positions, combating anti-Semitism. And we're going to look now, we're going to get through at least one. We'll see where the second one takes us, because, you also have really good questions that lead to really good conversation. So I've got what to lead us through, and however far we get, we get. Knowing that the content that I'm sharing with you is all on our website. All of the value propositions and all of these positions are on our website for you to peruse and share and use as you would like. Okay? So here we go. This is the congregation's core position on immigration. Hebel Beth El believes in dignity, honor, and humane treatment of all immigrants and refugees, regardless of their origin. As a people, we have wandered the desert in Canaan, were strangers in Egypt, and sought refuge after the Holocaust. We made our way back to Israel, the land of milk and honey, and to America, the land of opportunity. We are compelled to help others just as others helped us along our journey to redemption. So what I didn't do last time, and I want to do it now, is to lay this in front of you and say, what does this raise for you? What questions do you think it raises? What do you think this might lead us to try to look at, knowing that the next step is going to be looking to our tradition to help address some of those things? So as you read this, where's your mind take you? Spencer.
We were kind of at the mercy of others, not people the other, but just people who weren't Jewish. To let us in, to help clothe us, feed us, provide support. And yes, a lot of our ancestors came here and provided the foundation for others to join, but to some extent, organizations, charities, occasionally a nice immigration officer laid the foundation for Jews to be saved.
Totally. The only word I would maybe change what you said is mercy. Because mercy suggests a helplessness that I don't think is fair to describe. But we relied on the help, right? We relied on the support. We relied upon the care and compassion of other peoples, right? And it could be the individual, it could be that, that single immigration clerk at Ellis Island who, when given the choice between saying yes and saying no, let the benefit of the doubt lead him to say yes. Or organizations. Now I will share that organizations were not as helpful necessarily, right? So what did we do? We built our own, right? One of the great organizations, someone just said it, HIAS, right? The Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society was created, and one thing that I want to remind everybody is that the Jewish immigration story to America was not a single point in history. The Jewish immigration story itself had multiple waves, right? And one of the stories that one of the pieces of that story is the question of how helpful earlier Jewish immigrants we're going to be towards later Jewish immigrants. HIAS is the crown jewel example of earlier Jewish immigrants leaning into, reaching down on the next rung of the ladder to pull up Jews who were following behind and taking advantage of the knowledge that we had gained as a people about how to navigate this nation's immigration system. But that wasn't always the case. Lynn.
Is the highest the same as the joint?
No, the Joint Distribution Committee is a more global looking organization that is more interested, and listen, there's always overlaps in this. But the joint is more focused on supporting Jewish communities in situ wherever they may be around the world. Now, one element of that might be the need for migration, right? If think about, for example, the Jews of Ethiopia, right, where there was energies initially in helping sustain them where they were, and then the realization was actually the best thing for this community is to do a wholesale migration of this community out of Ethiopia into Israel, as an example. HIAS has been focused more on whether individual Jews or communities of Jews looking to navigate specifically migration into the US, that has been HIAS's focus. And we'll talk about how their work has grown from that in a moment. But I want to also, and I don't have this in Jarvis, I'm going to give an example. There was a political cartoon, and I wish I had thought to bring it, that dates to like the mid to late 19th century. And the cartoon is very well dressed German Jews at the docks, seeing babushka laden Jews from Eastern Europe coming in on the ships. And frankly, turning their nose up at that, right? Because there was ethnic and national feelings, let's say, between different groups of Jews. So not every Jewish immigrant, or listen, every Jew in America is the descendant of immigrants, right? Jews were not native to this community. So we all have an immigration story. Some Jews were more interested in bringing later immigrants into the community, and some were less interested, right? And mostly because they said, listen, we have worked so hard to be well respected, and now, this rabble of 2 parents and 12 kids and running around, like, it's gonna make us look bad, right? That's at the sense what is there. And that is a little bit of, there's a little bit of xenophobia within the Jewish community that we see. By the way, we certainly see it in Israel also, right? Between Ashkenazim and Sephardim and Mizrahim and all that as well. So that's there. But this position is there to remind us that our success as Jews in America is based in part on some people besides us, meaning us, the individual immigrants, just pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps and forcing our way into the country. there were people within the Jewish community, outside of the Jewish community, who took care and concern for us. Not everybody, not in equal parts, but always at certain points along the way. And that also speaks to one of the larger themes of our Jewish story, which is immigration being an example, or the need for immigration being an example of our people's journey from Egypt to the Promised Land, right? That we know what it feels like to live as an oppressed people. And therefore, it's our global responsibility to try to alleviate oppression when it is put in front of us. And for many folks, that means needing to leave wherever they live to come live somewhere where they can live more safely and more securely. Dora, you had your hand up.
I was gonna say immigration is a very complex problem.
Yeah.
It's been kicked down the road 1,000 times in our governments. And I'm gonna say even when people had good insight or good intention, and not even people who I particularly, like, I'm gonna say, the senator from Arizona and even Rubio, when they went wholeheartedly with their other colleagues on the other side, 5 years later, they were like basically shamed because they did that with good intention. Rubio clearly comes from a state full of immigrants. So.
And a family.
And a family, right, all that, all the above.
Right.
And my question is, how, I don't know how the temple or how the social action committee takes a look at this. I have to say, one time, my boyfriend was very surprised when I said, I think we need to make sure that we have good borders, because I cited that people don't realize what it is on a health, what it is, let's say, for a society. You have, you had 100 grand for your school system, and all of a sudden,
Right.
40,000 children are showing up.
So Dora, hold your question until we actually flesh it out, because you're talking about the entire conversation in 2 minutes. Right,
Okay,
you're
okay.
raising the right question, right? You asked the question, what does the temple think? I'm about to tell you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, appreciate that.
Right. And of course, what the temple think is gonna be informed by what our tradition says, okay? Anything else on this before we move into the texts that people are noticing?
And do you think that eventually passports will be obsolete and we can walk from one country to another and really be just one people?
So that is a very messianic way of seeing things, right? The idea that we live in a world where everyone lives in peace with one another. I will tell you that when I came back from Israel last month, I didn't need to show my passport to anybody, right? Because at the airport, it's a facial recognition. They already have my passport information, and in I went. So like, we're getting closer to a biometric as opposed to a paper passport. But Susan's asking a different question, which is, are we getting to a world where there will be no borders? I'm not sure. And to be honest, that is way beyond the scope of a synagogue's concern. That is a question for policy, not values. So let's move forward. All right. So what are the values, those foundational values that we decided were the ones that should inform our work? Loving the stranger, right? To hold in our hearts the welfare of immigrants. Now I want to point something out. That sentence, as well as the opening sentence of the statement, dignity, honor, and humane treatment of all immigrants. This is not a statement of who's in and who's out. This is not suggesting that we know what our immigration policy should be. This is orienting us towards acting with humanity towards everyone, wherever and whenever they are on an immigration journey and dealing with our immigration system. And I'll put this fine a point on it. By the end of this conversation, you're not going to know whether the temple thinks this person or that person should be admitted into the country or be not admitted or deported. That is not where this is going to take us. That is a question of policy that the temple is pretty far away from having expertise on. What we are going to say is that no matter where someone is, including if they are on the receiving end of an enforcement action, if they are being detained, if they are being held, if they are being transported, if they are being deported, they still deserve to be treated humanely in that process. which is a very, very different question than who's in and who's out. We'll come back to that. Hold in our hearts the welfare of immigrants. Justice, justice you shall pursue, inspires us to advocate for clear immigration policies that are justly enforced. Our policies should be clear, they should be justifiable, they should be enforced equally. But that doesn't mean it needs to be a free-for-all, or that there shouldn't be borders, or there shouldn't be policies. One of the problems with our system is that it is broken. And there are loopholes upon loopholes upon loopholes, and there's all different ways that people can either be taken in or taken out, and that's just not good practice, because it allows for the obfuscation of a just system and an obfuscation of humanity. Okay? One of the rabbi's teachings on that verse from Deuteronomy, why does it say the word justice twice? Justice, justice you shall pursue, is that it's a reminder that we should have just processes and just outcomes. We can't pursue just outcomes with unjust processes, and we can't be satisfied if just processes leave us with unjust outcomes. We have to pursue just outcomes through just processes. And I think immigration is a really good example of where well, we might not have either right now, but we're not going to have one without the other. You must not remain indifferent. Inspires us to respond to the mistreatment of the most vulnerable. Being indifferent, or excuse me, not being indifferent does not mean doing anything and everything for everyone. We may look at a scenario and say, we have done what we can to help this person or to help this group. And then any further action might upset another one of our values. That is not remaining indifferent. What we can't say is, we don't care about those people. That is the indifference that we can't. Of course, all of this is intention. All of this is complicated. All of this is easy to talk about around a Beit Midrash, and a lot harder when you're actually put it in practice. But this should be what guides us as we think about what policies we might advocate for, or what actions we might protest against. Okay. Which of the teachings of our tradition inspire us? You shall not wrong or oppress the stranger, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. When strangers reside within your land, you shall not wrong them. The strangers who reside with you shall be to you as your citizens. You shall love each one as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I, the Eternal, am your God. Right? So this does two things. It reminds us of our own immigration stories and our own vulnerability to oppression. And it sets a certain threshold, which is to say, thinking less of someone solely because they are not from this land is forbidden. Right? That doesn't speak to how they got here. Did they follow proper policies and whatnot? This is not a question on that. But to just look down on someone because they were born elsewhere, that is a violation of one of our values. And if there are people out in the community who are saying all immigrants should leave, all immigrants are bad, all immigrants are less than, we should be standing up to that and saying we don't believe the same thing. Questions?
So,
It seems so simple.
as
But
an
yeah,
immigrant.
yeah,
So the bottom line is.
we're not near the bottom line here.
Okay.
This is one of many. I'm laying out pieces.
So, doesn't matter what is your political belief or whatever, but you still have to respect someone because they're an immigrant. You
Well,
can't.
you
treat
respect them because they're a human being.
Human being.
And their being an immigrant doesn't call into question their humanity. That's the point. We are human beings first and foremost, and therefore deserve it of a certain level of dignity. And whether or not we are an immigrant may be an interesting question about certain, public policy questions. But just because you're an immigrant does not take away from the basic need to respect you fully as a human being first and foremost. And so if that means that our policies say that this particular human being is not welcome in this land, there's a way to effectuate that with humanity. And there's a way to effectuate it without humanity. And we are calling for the first one. Sherry.
Yeah, the B'Tselem Elohim
Right, exactly, yeah,
is the basis of.
correct. We are all created in God's image. No matter where we come from, no matter the color of our skin, all those pieces, all those different ways you can frame it, that is a human thing that supersedes even national border. And ought to be kept in mind as we are enforcing our borders. Susan.
This makes me think of two things about myself. One is, I think it doesn't matter what a person looks like or whatever. I'm gonna talk to them, and I have an opportunity through my work and through the organizations I belong to meet people from all over. On the other hand, I just thought of something. I always say, where are you from? It's like, why would I say that? Because I'm seeing that they're a little different and they must be from someplace else. But it's, I don't know.
I think that question goes both ways. If you're coming from a place of judgment, right? If you're looking to judge someone because of who they're from, it's the wrong instinct.
Yeah, but I'm-
If it's coming from a place of curiosity, oh, I want to know more about your story. I want to see the fullness of your humanity. I want to see the fullness of you. And, you know, I met someone yesterday. He's a new priest across the street at St. John's. He was born in Nigeria. He studied in Kenya, and now he is living here and serving St. John's and getting his PhD. To me, that is a better understanding of his humanity than, oh, he is a dark-skinned person from Africa. I can know that from looking at him and hearing his voice. I know that he has dark skin. I know that he's from Africa. To me, I think I'm doing a better job of seeing his humanity by knowing, oh no, he was born in Nigeria, lived there, and then moved to Kenya, and then moved here. So it all depends on which of your Yotzrim are asking, your Yetzer Hara or Yetzer Hatov. If you're asking out of a goodness, it's fine. If you're asking because you're looking to push away, not so fine. Spencer, and then move on to the next text.
I usually ask something like, oh, I don't recognize your accent. Where'd you grow up?
Cleveland. Moving on.
Well, I usually, sometimes I ask that and they're from the Midwest.
That's right, you betcha. All right. Rab Hunas and the Ramachab and the son of Rab Yehoshua said, it is quite clear to me that the residents of one town can prevent the residents of another town from setting up in competition in this town. But not, however, if he pays taxes to that town. And that the resident of an alley cannot prevent another resident of the same alley from setting up competition in his alley.
What does that mean?
What does it mean? Well, this is now our gloss on it. Rav Huna teaches us that while communities are justified in setting borders, they are also commanded to welcome those who wish to integrate themselves as neighbors. Okay? There's a tension in here, right? There's a really deep and powerful policy tension in these three sentences out of the Talmud. Because on the one hand, it says you can set up boundaries and borders and gates and expectations of those who might wish to join you. And if people are willing to meet those expectations, then they ought be welcomed. There's tension there. There is, like many things, and again, keep in mind, the Talmud was not designed to be the public policy of a modern day nation state. Right? You can't map this into what, ICE or DHS or USCIS policy should look like. This should be the idealistic North Star. What should our value, what should we be striving for to be able to point towards? And this says both and. Yes to borders, yes to clear policies, yes to clear expectations. I see your hand, Spencer. I'm looking for other voices just to make sure we're not letting them out of the conversation. What this doesn't say is Judaism says all immigrants are welcome. Doesn't say that. Right? All human beings are human beings and ought to be treated as such. But this says if there's good reason to set a boundary, set it. Do it justly, do it justifiably. Don't inform it indiscriminately, don't enforce it indiscriminately. Hold yourselves to the policies you set. Follow all other things, not to privilege the poor or privilege the rich, or all the other ideas of justice play in, but as a general rule, we are allowed to set borders. It's okay. And Once someone has made their way through the border, then, and they're, and quote unquote, this is where the paying taxes to the town, if you become a law-abiding resident of your new home, then you're, of them. And should not be subject to just wanton, well, we don't like you anymore. Thoughts, reflections, concerns, objections? Effigies,
What's effigies mean?
bad things about me. Yeah,
I'm just curious about the interconnection of these, or relationship of these to either A, Jewish life, or B, social life.
okay,
So
Say more.
when I look about, when I read, residents of one town, resident of another town, to say, okay, residents of Boca and residents of Deerfield.
Sure.
And that would be the direct, so that would be municipal.
Well, this is where I said that it's,
So the crossover from.
that the Talmud was not considering modern day nation states.
Yeah.
In its reasoning, right? We look for directionality, we look for value propositions.
I'm looking for the connection between the Jewish values and how those have leaked in and perfused civic law.
I think that's a different question
Yeah.
than this one, right? We have, right, in our society, in the US, an open border policy between municipalities and among the states, right? You don't need to present any paperwork to move from Florida into Georgia or from Georgia into Alabama, right? And if that were to be suggested, it would cut deeply against, I think, the American way. But that's not what this is about, because this imagines a world, or this is reflecting and coming from a world where towns actually did have borders between them that were guarded by walls and gates. Right? These were walled cities and alleyways where even, at what we might call a municipality, there actually were limits on who could come in and who couldn't come out. In ways that, as in modern society, we have elevated the borders to really only at the national level.
Oh, we
Okay.
have borders. If I move from Florida to Georgia, I have to change my documents.
Correct, but migration is not limited by.
But
Right.
in, like in Spain, I was looking at, when they're talking about alleys. Like if you're not in good shape, you're not gonna go to Torremolinos or Toledo, because the street is about as wide as this table, so. People were on this side of the alley or this side of the alley,
Right.
that's where they lived, and so all these medieval places all had big borders, and a
Right.
town was a town.
I actually enjoy that this line about the alley is saying something that you can't set up borders for fear of economic competition.
Right, but those
Right.
people were living in alleys, like.
They were working in it, exactly. So this idea of where we can make a migration checkpoints, to use modern language. In the ancient Near East, in late antiquity, and even the medieval world, it really was for the most part at the municipal level, right? It isn't anymore, at least not in our country, right? The checkpoints are really at the national borders. And so,
I'm sorry, but if you wanna go have an abortion and you come from a state that doesn't allow it, or there is checkpoints and it's happening all the time.
so yes and no, I think you're conflating migration checkpoints and policy checkpoints, right? So, if I'm living in Florida, where abortion is not legal past 6 weeks, the state cannot prevent me from getting on a plane and flying to a jurisdiction where it is legal, nor can the state of Florida prevent me from coming back having done that. They cannot stop me from coming in. Now, in certain states like Texas, they might try to sue me. But they're not, you get off the plane at Fort Lauderdale, there's no stopping you from making your way into Florida when you come off the plane. Different from when you land in Fort Lauderdale coming from out of the country, you have to go through customs and passport control. That's the simple line that I'm drawing here, right? This conversation is focusing on immigration and migration, not the overlapping patchwork of other public policies in a unique 21st century modern nation state that the Talmud could not imagine. Spencer.
I guess Marilyn was still waiting on you to identify whether your statement of traveling was migration or policy.
Migration.
Integrates. Would we translate that to assimilate or just ignore it? It's not worth the,
So
I know, different slightly.
ask your question better. Integrate means to become part of the society.
Yeah, that's basically did,
Right.
but is the Jewish teaching saying you must integrate / assimilate? Or is it saying, no, just physical borders?
No, I think if you look at the first part that suggests that we can prevent the person who's coming to town who doesn't want to pay taxes, but we can't present the person who does want to pay taxes, suggests that there is a moral, it is morally allowable to set up certain expectations of behavior of the person who immigrates in. Right? And that the society, again, keeping notions of justice in mind, as long as those expectations are fair and just, that's okay, right? I'm gonna use a little bit of a complicated counterexample. If we look at some of the communities in Europe, there have been communities that have migrated, and I'm gonna be very generalization here, but communities that are overwhelmingly Muslim from the Middle East, who have migrated into some of the major cities in Western Europe. And one of the challenges that those communities have is that there is a lack of integration. Those communities are essentially living siloed in their own community, separate from the larger polity, right? And there's actually, there's sort of high level debate, which is to say that the public policy mistake was not having more expectations that the folks who were moving to London and moving to Paris would integrate themselves into London society, into Paris society, into French national society, into English national society. I think assimilation, you use them interchangeably or as equal synonyms. I think they're not actually. I think, if I'm defining this out, there is a spectrum between complete cloistering, right? And I think of, certainly if you look at like the Satmars of Brooklyn,
Yes.
right? Who try their best to interact with no one outside their community and live their lives in complete isolation from the world around them. That's at one extreme. And some of the residents of London and Paris I just referred to are trying to sort of be in that space. Assimilation is near the far end, which is to say that actually I am willing to move off of much of my identity to become part of a larger something or other, right? I grew up in the time when we said America was a melting pot, which actually I think was and then we said, that's the wrong metaphor. Because in a melting pot, what happens is we all become eventually, or generations all the same. When I was growing up, it was like, no, we're moving into the salad bowl, right? What's the beauty of the salad bowl? The individual ingredients retain their individual integrity, and the bowl is made better because of the variety of textures and flavors, right? A bowl of romaine, but romaine with carrots and cucumbers and tomatoes and interesting dressings, and that's really tasty. So the integrate to me piece is in that middle ground, which is retaining much of my identity while also striving to be part of the basic tenets of the society to which I am immigrating. And I gotta be really, really honest. I can't think of an example of a group better than American Jews who have modeled that over the last century. Right? American Jews are integrated into American society. On the extremes, there are Jews who have completely assimilated, right? Who have abandoned really moved away from their Judaism. And there are Jews who continue to retain their separatism, but for the most part, we are well integrated, and that's for the good, right? The moment that we sort of almost went around the bend was when we thought about, should we change Shabbat from Saturday to Sunday to better be in line with Americans? This is a real conversation in late 19th century American Judaism, and they said, actually, no, that's a bridge too far, right? We're going to have a Sabbath. We're going to be respectful of the Sabbath laws in our community, but we're going to do our things our own way. Okay.
Thank you, that was a really great answer.
Appreciate it. God gathered the dust of the first human from the four corners of the world, red, white, black, and green. Red is the blood, black is the entrails, green for the body. Why from the four corners of the earth? So that if one comes from the east to the west and arrives at the end of his life as he near departing from the world, the land will not say to him, the dust of your body isn't mine. Go back to where you were created. Rather, every place a person goes, a part of him is from there and a part of him is returning there. A beautiful midrash, right? This is a midrash, of course, that comes out of the story of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, that God created humanity out of the earth, right? What is the word for the first human being in Hebrew?
Adam.
Adam, right? The human being. What is it etymologically connected to? Adamah, which is the word for earth, soil, right? That God collected earth to fashion that human being, breathed life into the nostril of that human being, created a second human being out of part of that first human being, right? So that at our core, of course, this is medieval. We come from the earth, but we come from the entire earth. That we are all descendants of that single first human being. No one of us is closer to God than any other, right? Because we are all descendants from a single human being. And that human being is not from any one part of the earth. We are all from all of the earth, irrespective of the place on earth at which we were born. This medieval rabbinic teaching reminds us of the divine connection between all human beings, regardless of their place of birth or the color of their skin, reinforcing our responsibility to treat all with dignity and respect.
I like that the earth has four corners in this statement. I know it's medieval.
Yeah. The earth has four corners, four quadrispheres.
You're right.
Of course. Observations, connections.
It's not about treating, it is about treating others with dignity and respect, but it starts, I think, with treating oneself with dignity
Sure.
and respect.
Sure. So what are some of the organizations we are working with? So I mentioned HIAS, right? And HIAS is sort of the leader on this, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society that was established over 100 years ago to help specifically getting Jews into the US. And, but then what happened was by the time we got sort of past the midpoint of the 20th century, with the exception of a major migration of Jews from the former Soviet Union, mass migration of Jews into the US came to a conclusion, right? And so HIAS had to reconsider its mission. It could have closed shop and said, mission accomplished, right? All the Jews who want to come to America know how to get in. Mission accomplished. But they didn't do that. What they said was, we have so much institutional wisdom and knowledge on how to navigate the ever-changing immigration system in the US that those teachings from before about our responsibility to share because we know compels us to now look outside the Jewish world, right? And so HIAS has been working with immigrant communities, with refugee communities, with people, and there's all, people seeking asylum, all these different types of migration that we can talk about. And HIAS has worked, to help people along the way, but has always looked to, when looking for local support and national support, look specifically to the Jewish community to be at the center of the table as to who's going to be on the ground, right? So like, for example, when the war between Russia and Ukraine started, those 3 or 4 years ago, can't believe it's been that long already.
Yeah.
And Ukrainian refugees were looking to make their place here to America. HIAS looked for Jewish communities who were looking to be hosts, right? Who could mobilize at the local. If you want to host a family, it takes a lot. It takes a lot of volunteer hours and a little bit of money to help a family get integrated. And it's like a 6 to 12 month process. So you need a lot of people, right? Because you can't put it all in the backs of 3 households, right? We would want 100 volunteers from Bethel to help land 2 households. That's the kind of work It did it for Afghan refugees and Syrian, I mean, when there have been moments of crisis in other parts of the world, you had mass migration of refugees. It looked to support. Unfortunately, their reality is challenged by both cuts in government funding and changing political appetites around the country, but believe me, they're still there. So one thing that Highest did earlier this year was they put out a call to congregations to rally interfaith communities, just to remind their communities about the need about these values, right? Not necessarily to advocate for policies, but to re-amplify the voice. They tasked us with doing it in like June and July, because there were two anniversaries, one with the SS St. Louis and one with the passing of a bill. And so a lot of communities did this in June, and I said to my friend Rabbi Sarah Basson, who is the rabbinic liaison at Highest, to say that June is not the time for us. June is not when Boca Raton can be activated. But we did do an event in September, right? Some of you were there. It was an event that we put on in partnership with the Boca Interfaith Clergy. We worked with the Florida Immigration Coalition. It was a very powerful night at St. Gregory's Church, if you remember from a few months ago, where we, again, just amplified that message. We did an event with Flick 10 days ago. Flick, the Florida Immigrant Coalition, right, here's a good example, came to us to say that there are a lot of people who are legal residents of the US, they have their green card. But when you have your green card, while you're entitled here legally and, without any expiration date, you're still not fully secure as if you were a naturalized citizen, right? And there's a lot of people who are eligible to be citizens who have not gone through the application process. And a lot of people who have applied because the process is daunting to get them off the ground. And they've had a lot of success holding citizenship drives where they have trained volunteers who can help an immigrant person, immigrant family, begin that application process, get the ball rolling, and help guide them along the way so they can make their way towards a journey that would end, God willing, for them in naturalization. And they came to us to say, we've been doing these events in Broward. They've been very, very successful. But there are plenty of people who live in Palm Beach County for whom the trip to Broward is also more than they would prefer or more than they can manage. Would you be willing to offer this event in Palm Beach County? And perhaps even in your building? And we said, yes. And so, last Saturday, 2 Saturdays ago?
Yeah. 2 Saturdays.
2 Saturdays ago, or 10 days ago? Saturday, Shabbat, the Beck Family Campus is empty on Shabbat. We don't have programming there. And so we spent 5 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours helping, a good number of folks come and get their applications done, right? That's an example of the immigrant community coming to us to say, we have a very specific need. It certainly fits within the boundaries of the law as it exists, right? We weren't breaking the law. We weren't challenging the law. We were just facilitating following the law. Just as Rav Huna would suggest that we should. But offering the type of material support that was necessary to allow more folks to follow within this. It seemed like it called exactly out of the place that we were coming from. And now the question is only, when are we gonna do it again? Which we're working on. Questions?
I don't know whether, oh, I'm sorry.
Send it in Ted.
Go ahead, ladies.
I have learned a lot about how, and I totally agree with your explanation on how human beings come first.
Mhm.
And this is our obligation as Jews, as a community beyond being Jewish and so on. What is this temple's position on ICE?
That is a complicated question.
It goes well in a drink.
No, because ICE, so the question, it can be answered on multiple levels. Are we asking about, should we have an immigration and customs enforcement agency? Of course we should, because we should have clear, just laws around immigration, and laws need enforcement, right? That's one answer to your question. Question number two is ICE as a law enforcement agency, are they systemically violating principles of justice in what they do? If we believe the answer to be yes, then we should be raising our voices around that. And are individual are individual ICE employees? Are they violating these principles of human dignity? I was interested in the answer to questions 2 and 3 is most likely yes, they are. And then what is the job of a synagogue to be the ombudsman for the society around it?
Is there a job?
Well, that's an interesting question, right? I would say part of the reason why we identify these partner organizations is we are probably not the best type of organization to decide when something needs to be called out. We rely, on organizations where this is their raison d'etre to call us to say, we are seeing something. And I think that, what called me to lead this entire process from the outset was our greatest value is our voice. Right? We are an amplifier of a message as a 2,000 family congregation. And so when there are messages that are in keeping with what we stand for, that could serve to be amplified. And this is where it's gonna be really complicated, and amplifying it on the whole is good for the synagogue, then there's an opportunity there. Right? So for example, there's a bi-weekly interfaith group that is meeting in Broward outside one of the detention centers to call attention to the inhumanity that's going on within the detention center. And they have asked our clergy to participate in that. Raise your hand if you think we should. Raise your hand if you think we shouldn't. All right, well, we're going to, right? Because what we are being called upon to do is to say, our tradition says that for what we understand what's going on in there, humanity isn't being respected, right? And, the other thing that I think about, and this is a deeply pragmatic way to frame it, is, it's that lever thing, right? It's very easy as a faith-based institution to spend every breath you have shouting at the rain, right? And I can spend every day jumping up and down about all the things that I think ICE is doing that is wrong. Here's what I also know. They're duly elected, right? There's a president, there's a Congress who are responsible for our immigration policies, and they were duly elected. And so for me to say, right, that the duly elected Congress, the duly elected president should not be doing what they set out to do, to me, that's a little bit of a critique of our democratic system, right? Which is different than saying the way that they're doing it should be done differently because they're not upholding this other piece of our tradition. It's very complicated. Very complicated. It's very nuanced. It's very nuanced. Plenty of people would say I'm yellow and a coward for having said what I just said.
I have another rabbi question, this one.
Can I ask Ted's question first and I'll come back to you? Ted.
Yeah, I'm not sure this is relevant, but
Okay, well,
would the immigration of the Jews, does that contribute to anti-Semitism?
would the immigrant, that's a very, I don't understand the hypothetical. When you said would the immigration of the Jews, what are you talking about?
No, is that one of the reasons that this persecution of the Jews and
Are you asking historically or currently?
currently?
I mean, listen, there are plenty of Jews who live in this country. I mean, plenty is a relative number, but 7 million Jews, we're 2% of the population. Would there be anti-Semitism if there were no Jews in our community? Probably.
Yes.
Do I think that, and what's interesting is to say that if you look, and this is very, very on one foot, but the better people understand the Jewish community, for the most part, the less anti-Semitism they hold in their heart. That anti-Semitism for most people is born out of ignorance and a lack of understanding, not from close relationship. Now, there are some people who see up close and hate, but that I think is the minority of most people. So I actually think, to answer your question, that a deeper presence of Jews probably directly lowers anti-Semitism, but it's not a one-to-one, because people will do what people will do. Right? I mean, look at this example that happened 2 weeks ago in Mississippi. You have a kid who lived in Jackson for 19 years. Jews have lived there for 160 years, and he's anti-Semitic. Which is the cause? I don't think it was the presence of Beth Israel, because if I had to guess, the kid didn't have any animus against any one of the 150 families who go to Beth Israel. I'm sure he knew some of them. And his animus came from elsewhere. And there, I'm sure, it was an opportunity for him to act upon his anti-Semitism because he lived in a city that had a synagogue. If he lived in a different part of Mississippi and had the same exposure, would it have been harder for him to act upon it? Maybe. But now we're really going down the rabbit hole.
Just quickly, does jealousy have to do with anti-Semitism? For
So,
the fact that
I'm gonna-
this is so successful?
I'm gonna invite you to join us tonight at 7 o'clock. We have a Zoom this evening. Our Anti-Semitism Social Justice Circle is hosting my colleague, Rabbi Diana Fursko, who recently wrote a book about what is anti-Semitism. Join us tonight at 7 and we can have that conversation. That's a better conversation for tonight than right now.
Very good.
Sandy, your second question.
It's a rabbi question that intersects with the whole ICE issue that is a very difficult thing to talk about because of complexity.
Sure.
However, there are a lot of people in the community who are really concerned
Yeah.
about the number of bad people who have come, who are child molesters, beat up their wives, and do all kinds of horrible
Right.
things. And
Meaning folks who were immigrants.
yes.
who've done those things. Yeah, okay.
Illegal immigrants who are here, who have had these kinds of things.
Sure.
Now, if, in the larger context, if we are to embrace this idea that all humans are made in God's image.
Uh-huh.
How do we confront the reality of these
You
people?
go to jail because you broke the law and you harmed people. You're not tortured. You have, our country has legal protections for defendants and even convicts, right? There are basic human rights. You go to jail where you should be expected to live safely in jail with meals that won't kill you in jail, right? So sending someone to prison is not a violation of their human dignity or their basic human rights.
So is it wrong to capture that?
No, as I said 20 minutes ago, an immigration enforcement action is not by definition a violation of human dignity. The way in which it is done is what matters, right? If let's talk about the person that you're describing, the person who we have probable cause to think has committed these violent acts, right? They should be taken into custody and they should be processed and do all the things that our legal process is there to do. Does that mean that they should be dragged through the street by their ankles naked over gravel because we're trying to get our pound of flesh on them before they face the business end of our judicial system? No, because in our country, we have established that defendants are entitled to certain protections as well. What you're talking about, what I just described, is a lynching, right? We don't do lynchings. We do judicial processes.
I agree, I'm just looking to get some clarity on where the temple is on, for example, what's going on in Minneapolis and St. Paul.
The temple isn't anywhere on that question because there's so many different facets to it,
Okay.
right? The temple stands up for actions that are done justifiably and justly, and stands against actions that are done unjustifiably and unjustly.
So has there been a stance taken on people who get into their cars and interfere
No,
with the actions of ICE?
no, that is not, that we are not making individual statements on individual events. We are informing ourselves of what our tradition teaches us, giving to the community to say, listen, as you think about in your own life, what you're compelled by, we think these are the parts of our tradition that speak exactly to what's going on right now. And what happened in Minneapolis is a question for the law of Minneapolis and the federal courts in Minnesota to deal with. And we're gonna have our own concerns about it, right? That incident, right, in the eye of the beholder looks very, very, very different depending on how you look at it. What I think should happen is like any other person who commits homicide, right, meaning the taking of the life of another human being, that incident should be investigated, right? And it may be they're exonerated. Or it may be that they are, or maybe that they are put up for some kind of prosecution. And maybe they're convicted and maybe not. Now, what I don't think should happen, to be perfectly honest, is that a law enforcement official of any kind should not have to face any scrutiny at all. Simply because they're a law enforcement official.
Agreed, but what I'm
That's it.
talking
You asked my
about
question.
is the invasion of the church yesterday. On Sunday, on Sunday tonight, yesterday on Sunday, with Don Lemon and his crowd, who are now the people who are at the extreme end.
Right, so I'm not gonna speak, I'm not gonna defend extremists of any kind. let's move forward. We've got 5 minutes to talk about abortion rights. No, we're not gonna get that deep into it, right? Because again, I just wanna show you similar structure, right? A core position. The values that undergird it. A series, and this is really long, a series of texts from our tradition that speak to the question, right? And I will tell you that, when we get to questions around abortion access, there's a lot of speaking to the question without speaking with an answer. Because guess what? That's actually the Jewish way. Right? The Jewish way doesn't say what immigrants are in and what immigrants are out, and what law enforcement actions are justified and what are not. The Jewish way is to raise questions, right? Because the Jewish tradition was not meant to be a modern government. We're supposed to have modern governments that functions differently. It has different desired outcomes and different needs of responsibility, right? What I can tell you is that our Jewish tradition, A, does not categorically dismiss or does not categorically consider a fetus as a full human life. We know that's one thing to be true. The tradition does not have a single position on when the fetus becomes a human life. It does ascribe it some value, and that value increases along the way of the gestational period. And it recognizes that the well-being of the fetus and the well-being of the mother carrying the fetus may sometimes be in tension, and in general suggests that we ought privilege the well-being of the mother over the fetus. Not always, and not exclusively, but in general. These are a lot of generalizations. And that the well-being of the mother is certainly that she should live, but also that she should live healthfully, and that health is both physical and psychological, right? All these different pieces does not say at what point there should be a boundary as to when abortion should be legal or not. However, if I can editorialize the conclusion, because I have, because you heard me say it multiple times, the general idea is that a blanket prohibition of abortion does run counter to the Jewish tradition's thinking about abortion. And so I believe, and this is me saying personally, as a rabbi, I believe that the law in Florida is an infringement or an impingement on our religious freedoms. Because our tradition would suggest that we have more flexibility in choosing when to have an abortion than the law allows for. And living in a country and in a state where religious freedom is itself a reality that has within it tension, right? The First Amendment says Congress should not infringe upon religion or establish it. Those work in opposite directions. Because if you're going to protect religion from infringement, you're doing some modest establishments, and there's an internal tension there, right? And so there's a lot of different things where if religious traditions think you need something, or your tradition compels you to have access to something, if the law says you can't, there's a problem there, right? There was a time 10 years ago when the lawmakers in certain Scandinavian countries were, out of a sense of animal cruelty, wanted to require that animals be electrically stunned before they were slaughtered. Okay? It's reasonable. It's reasonable. If you stun them first, then they can't feel the knife of the slaughter. Problem is, because that is a direct outlaw of kosher butchery. Because kosher butchering requires actually the opposite, that the animal be healthy and cogent, and then to be slaughtered as quickly as possible with a single cut of the throat, because that is considered the most humane way to do it. And if they were to pass a law that requires the stunning, you have essentially outlawed Jewish life, because you've outlawed kosher butchery. To say nothing of the next group of people who were trying to outlaw infant circumcision, right? Outlawing something, mandating something, or allowing people to make their choice, it's kind of a three-prong, it's either A, B, or C. And as a religious minority, we are most often in the best place to say that C for choice, is probably the best place for us. It doesn't require us to do things that we wouldn't want to do, doesn't require us to participate in a Christian prayer in school, for example. It doesn't prevent us from worshiping on our own as we should. But these are tensions here. And our Jewish tradition did not imagine, well, I mean, listen, the teachings from the upper teaching, as an example, from the 18th century, that could not imagine modern day American life. Rabbi Waldenberg in 1978 had a pretty good sense of what American life was like, right? This was coming around after Roe. He had a sense of what life in America could look like with our patchwork of legal systems in certain states and the national government, all that kind of stuff. And even then, it's a little bit complicated. It's complicated. And the last thing I want to remind everybody, and Sandy, your question raised this a little bit, is if and when the temple were to take a position or to activate on a certain issue, it is not mandating that every person in the congregation agree with it or support it or participate in it. What it is saying is that a preponderance of the members of this congregation feel strongly enough about this to make it part of our policy, and the congregation, in the name of the congregation, is going to go act on it. And if you feel like you don't want to, that's okay. That's okay. But we're not going to give every member of the congregation a veto power to say, well, I don't agree with that, so the temple shouldn't do it. Right? That, by the way, was a step out onto the branch, so to speak. It's a very vulnerable thing for the temple to have done. And I applaud our board of trustees for taking that step. And I encourage all of you to read this and pass it on and talk about it and come to a justice committee meeting or